Good evening. It's December 5th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly webcast with LaRouchePack.com. We broadcast Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Megan Beats from the LaRouchePack Scientific Research Team, as well as Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review. The three of us have been in discussions with Mr. LaRouche over the last 48 hours. And what we're going to do to begin tonight's proceedings is I would like to just ask Dennis Small to immediately come to the podium to deliver Mr. LaRouche's primary message for this evening.
Thank you. Mr. LaRouche is most concerned that a following very straightforward message be delivered and received as to the gravity of the current situation. The fact is that we are facing a very serious threat of general warfare facing the entire planet today, and this is a result of the strategic provocations against Russia and China which are being carried out by the British Empire, its bankrupt transatlantic financial system, and the Obama administration in the United States in particular. Their intention in these strategic provocations is to annihilate the region of Eurasia. Global general warfare today, however, means global thermonuclear warfare. And that means the likelihood of the extinction of the entire human species, including the United States, including Eurasia, the entire planet. As the public statements of Russian President Putin have made very clear over the last 72 hours, Russia's policy, Mr. LaRouche emphasized, is planned and designed to meet the standard of winning war. There's no question as to what he is saying. It is real, it is very serious, and it's a fair and accurate expression of the situation we're facing. So the possibility of war is there. Mr. LaRouche emphasized that we can neither say that it will happen, nor can we deny the possibility that it will occur. The threat is there, the threat is real. That's what we can say. And we can also say that President Obama and many members of his administration, such as the State Department's Victoria Nuland, are dangerous idiots. Unless Obama and everything he entails is pulled into restraint by saner, wiser heads in the United States, then we could have an extermination war that would be the end of the United States and the world population. Either the United States calls off the war and throws Obama out, or there can be an extermination war that is absolutely the end of humanity as we know it. Decisive action by U.S. agencies is needed now, Mr. LaRouche stressed. As for Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, she is a highly active provocateur and a fool, Mr. LaRouche said, and she's expendable. She expresses the problem, and she should be removed from office over this very weekend. Get her out, and we can jam up the works. He suggested land Nuland on the moon, preferably on the dark side so we don't have to see her. That will buy us some time to put together a more lasting solution to the crisis. He also said in the discussions that we had with him that the Republican Party and its present dirty schemes also has to be gotten rid of, because these too are leading the world towards hell. Excuse me. He said that Speaker Boehner's role in particular, both in protecting Obama from a fully justified constitutional impeachment and in aggressively provoking Russia and China, as can be seen in the House resolution that was presented and adopted this week, that role is disgusting, and Boehner has to go too. So to summarize, we're at the edge of global thermonuclear war. There is discussion in Europe about a 70 to 75% chance of the outbreak of a general war. That, Mr. LaRouche stressed, is a fair reading. How do we go about stopping it? Throw Nuland out now. Just throw the bitch out. Then the Ukrainian operation against Russia can be defused, and although that does not end the threat, it does defuse it. Will Nuland be thrown out? If so, then we may be able to prevent the march to war now. It won't stop the danger, but it sets back the possibility of global war in the near term, and that is urgently required.
Just one note concerning what Dennis mentioned about John Boehner. It is important to note that whereas he fast-tracked this disgusting piece of legislation, this resolution condemning Putin and Russia to the floor for a vote in the United States House, he's been sitting on a resolution for over a year that was introduced by Walter Jones, calling for the declassification of the 28 pages concerning the Saudi sponsorship for 9/11 and the relationship of the Bush family to that. So the cover-up for the Bush family is blatant for all to see, both from Boehner and Obama. Now, we just received word that a few hours ago, a resolution was called to our attention that was published in the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit, that was signed by 60 prominent German political figures. The title of this resolution was "War in Europe Again, Not in Our Name," which calls on the German parliament to stop sleepwalking into a war with Russia, and declares that Russia has just as much right to feel secure as any other nation in Europe. The resolution states that Russia has been an integral part of Europe since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and every attempt that's been made to go to war against Russia has resulted in total defeat for anyone who attempted it. Most notably, it says, Nazi Germany. The signatories on this resolution include former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, former State President Roman Herzog, former Chancellery Minister Horst Telschik, former Assistant Defense Minister Walter Stützle, and the present chairman of the East Trade Division of the German Industrialist Association, Eckhard Cordes, among numerous others. Very significantly, this resolution is now appearing at the same time that a resolution written by Helga LaRouche calling for both Europe and the United States to stop this insane geopolitical confrontation against Russia and China and to join the BRICS process is also circulating internationally. Now, what this resolution states, warning against the folly of military confrontation with Russia, and specifically citing the case of Nazi Germany, resonates very clearly with the address that President Putin delivered yesterday during his annual speech to both houses of the Federal Assembly of Russia, his State of the Union, where he said the following: "Even Hitler, given all of his hatred for humanity, failed in his attempts to destroy Russia and push us back beyond the Ural Mountains. Everyone should remember how this ends. Next year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Our army crushed the enemy and liberated Europe. No one will ever attain military superiority over Russia. We have a modern and combat-ready army. We have the strength, the will, and the courage to protect our freedom." Putin went on to say that Russia will defend its sovereignty at all costs and will never surrender it. He said, "If for some European countries national pride is a long-forgotten concept and sovereignty is too much of a luxury, true sovereignty for Russia is an absolute necessity for survival. I would like to emphasize this: either we remain a sovereign nation, or we dissolve without a trace and lose our identity." Now, Putin went on to refer specifically to the situation in Ukraine, stressing that even if none of the events that have occurred over the past year in Ukraine had happened, Russia's adversaries would have come up with some other pretext to use as an excuse to attack Russia, saying that the policy of containment against Russia is not something new, but something which has been carried out against Russia for many years, for decades, if not centuries, he said. And any time someone thought that Russia was getting too independent or strong, he said, the same formula of war and destabilization has been unleashed, although unsuccessfully. Now, very interestingly, the example he chose to give of this was the open Western support for the Chechen separatists in the 1990s, which has now become increasingly relevant again today, not only because of the high density of Chechen fighters who are part of ISIS, but also because of the fresh violence that had just erupted literally hours before Putin's speech in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in which a group of terrorists attacked a police checkpoint, killing several officers, and then occupied the publishing house downtown along with a neighboring school. Ultimately, 10 police officers were killed and 9 of the terrorists after intense fighting. So what Putin said was the following. He said, "We remember well how and who almost openly supported separatism back then, and even outright terrorism in Russia. Who it was who referred to murderers, whose hands were stained with blood, as none other than rebels, and organized high-level receptions for them. These rebels have now showed up in Chechnya again. Let me reiterate, we remember the high-level receptions for terrorists dubbed as fighters for freedom and democracy. The support for separatism in Russia from across the pond, including information, political and financial support, and support provided by the special services, was absolutely obvious and left no doubt that they would gladly let Russia follow the Yugoslav scenario of disintegration and dismemberment, with all the tragic fallout for the people of Russia. It didn't work. We didn't allow that to happen." Now, clearly, this reference to the Chechen wars in the 1990s corresponds to what Lyndon LaRouche was intervening into then with his Storm Over Asia video, which we showed at a broadcast here a few months ago, in which Mr. LaRouche identified precisely who it was in both London and in Washington who were openly supporting the Chechen separatists then and using them as mercenaries to destabilize Russia, and who continue to support these mercenaries today, which includes the role of Saudi Arabia. So this policy has clearly only continued and escalated, and we've now reached the showdown moment in which we find ourselves on the edge of World War III. So, Dennis, it's very clear from this German resolution that I mentioned that there are some people who are definitely getting the message that Putin so clearly delivered in his speech. Could you please fill out the picture for us a little bit regarding this situation more generally?
Yeah. We'll come back to this issue of the Chechen rebels and Putin's comments about this, because this, in fact, takes us to the heart of the situation of the Obama administration and the Victoria Nuland issue that Mr. LaRouche is signaling as a crucial plug in this whole thing that has to be pulled immediately to defuse the danger of war. But let me preface that by noting a couple of things. First of all, the warning of the danger of the current situation is not only coming from Putin, although it is perhaps in the starkest of terms coming from him. It's not only being recognized explicitly by thinking people in Germany and some in the United States as well as to how completely insane and dangerous the track of the Obama administration is. But I think it's important to note as well that the government of China not only is aware of the kinds of things that the Russians are pointing to, but in fact share their evaluation and are responding accordingly as well. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a statement in response to the Putin State of the Union speech, the most important speech of the year for the Russian president. And they welcomed the speech, saying the following: China is determined to keep building up the strategic partnership with Russia. We respect the road taken by the Russian nation. We watched the Russian president's statement with great interest. The level of trust and cooperation between our countries is very high. And then separately, President Xi Jinping of China, in a keynote address he delivered November 28th, 29th, to the highest level Central Conference on Foreign Affairs of his country, besides proposing and elaborating on his approach of a win-win or advantage of the other approach to foreign policy, that we have to have, he said, a neighborhood policy featuring amity, sincerity, mutual benefit, and inclusiveness, which reminds me, at least, of the good neighbor policy of FDR. But he also warned in his own way of the dangers that China faces and the world faces. And he said, we should be fully alert to the grave nature of international tensions and struggle, but we also need to recognize that peace and development, the underlying trend of our times, will remain unchanged. He said we should fully recognize the uncertainty in China's neighboring environment, but we should also realize that the general trend of prosperity and stability in the Asia-Pacific will not change. That a clear reference to what the BRICS countries are doing. So the Chinese are very clear about what's going on. Within Europe, when Mr. LaRouche made a reference to the fact that there is discussion underway that there is a 70 to 75% probability of a general war being unleashed, the most public statement to that effect came from the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, who in a speech on December 2nd, just 3 days ago, said that there is indeed a probability of a broader Russia-NATO war of about 70%. And he said, and I quote, I am talking about a large military conflict now. I am not talking about a Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, Mr. LaRouche's response to these comments of the Slovakian Prime Minister are that they are a fair estimate. And he elaborated that the lie, much circulated in the West, about Russia being bankrupt, and possibly as a result of the sanctions being imposed by Obama and NATO, is just that. It is a complete lie. It is the transatlantic sector that is bankrupt. It is their policy that is bankrupt. It is Victoria Nuland and everything she represents that is bankrupt, Mr. LaRouche said. Russia is not. Russia is simply preparing for war. They are putting a lot of money into preparing for World War III. Now, on the Victoria Nuland question, Mr. LaRouche, a week or two ago, you may recall, if you've been watching these webcasts, said that there's no basis for discussing or negotiating anything with Ukraine so long as the fascists remain in control of that situation there. And the fascists were put in control of the situation in Ukraine by Victoria Nuland. This was made public, it was made open at the time by her famous telephone conversation with the American ambassador, where she named specifically who she did and did not want in the Ukrainian government. And she named that Yats, as she called him, Yatsenyuk, should be named prime minister. And sure enough, Yats was named and remains prime minister today. And after having created this government, and the famous phone call where she discussed this with Ambassador Pyatt, she was asked, well, what about Europe's view? And she said, well, F Europe. And that made the rounds, although the content of the policy was not as much discussed as that four-letter word. But it may be the reason why in Germany today she is known as Victoria Nuland. And perhaps also the reason why she operates with Angela Merkel's full support. Now, Victoria Nuland has not been quiet or silent or inactive since putting the fascists in power in Ukraine. In October, November, she toured many of the Baltic countries. She delivered a blood-curdling speech attacking the Russians at the Aspen Institute in Berlin. And in one of her speeches, she said the following, in the Baltic, she said, quote, "We are ready to give our lives for the security of these countries," which is a pretty strong statement from someone who has no intention whatsoever of being in harm's way. Now, who is Victoria Nuland? Victoria Nuland is a total neocon. She was the principal deputy foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney in the Bush-Cheney administration. Excuse me, in the Cheney-Bush administration. Not only that, Victoria Nuland is married to Robert Kagan, who is one of the best-known neoconservatives in the United States. In fact, so famous is he that Barack Obama last year, or perhaps it was 2012, it was in 2012, praised Kagan's recently published article in the New Republic called The Myth of American Decline, and he demanded that his entire cabinet read it and probably memorize it. So Obama is completely on with Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan. Obama is a neocon, and that's one of the reasons he gets along so famously with the neocons in the Republican Party, and one of the reasons why Boehner and Obama are doing exactly the same thing in the provocations against Russia and pretty much on all fronts. I think we could refer to him as Barack Obamacon. Now, most recently, a new cabinet was named in Ukraine. I think you can guess who named it. It was appointed by Yats, the prime minister, by the grace of Victoria Nuland. And to this cabinet, 3 foreigners were named to rather important positions: finance minister, economics minister, and health minister. They were foreigners up until the last minute, whereby an unusual decree, they were named citizens of Ukraine. The first is an American, Natalie Jaresko, who is a hedge fund manager of Horizon Capital and was the head of the economic section of the United States Embassy in Kiev. The economics minister, a Lithuanian, which is a country which is a host to NATO military forces preparing for war with Russia, himself was also a hedge fund manager, and so on and so forth. So these are the people who Victoria Nuland has been placing into positions of power in Kiev. But I think what goes even closer to the heart of the matter, let's recall what Putin said in his speech that Matthew was just referring to. One thing he mentioned was, with a little bit of his typical sense of humor, he said, well, I mentioned our American friends for a reason, since they are always influencing Russia's relations with its neighbors, either openly or behind the scenes. Sometimes it is even unclear whom to talk to the governments of certain countries or directly with their American patrons and sponsors. Now, of course, if they talk to the Ukrainian government, they don't have to worry about it because it's the same people. Now, as for Putin's discussion mentioned by Matthew about how the 2 Chechen wars of the late 1990s were the beginning of the offensive which threatens the very national security and existence of Russia, and he talked about people who organized high-level receptions, quote unquote, for Chechen terrorists. Well, who were those people who organized the high-level receptions for them? Well, first and foremost, London, a fact which Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, formally protested against. Boris Berezovsky financed the whole thing, and he was given safe harbor in London. And then there was something called the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, which was organized by neocons in the United States in 1999. The founding board members included Zbigniew Brzezinski, Alexander Haig, and others. And among the prominent members of that group, the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, were Richard Pearl, Frank Gaffney, James Woolsey, and Robert Kagan. That is to say, Mr. Victoria Nuland. So I think you can understand what the significance of this Nuland question is. You have one of the chief foreign policy advisors to Dick Cheney running Obama's policy in the interests of the British Empire, in an area where we are a hair's breadth away from triggering thermonuclear war with the Russians. And getting her out of the way, whether it's to the dark side of the moon preferably or anywhere else, is clearly a total priority strategically. There are voices of sanity presenting different views. In Germany and here as well, there are people who think that this is a completely lunatic approach. German Foreign Minister Steinmeier has stated that we have to have channels of communication open with the Russians. Helmut Schmidt in Germany has argued that we have to stop provoking China, that we're totally ignorant of their interests and we should not continue to be so. And inside the United States, people like Paul Pillar, a longtime veteran of the CIA, who does not only speak for himself, but clearly reflects the views of many people in the security and the intelligence establishment, has stated that Russia's recent actions is entirely explained by the fact that they are responding to the eastward expansion of NATO, to the provocations coming from the Obama administration, and to the existential threats that they are facing.
Now, our institutional question for this evening reads as follows, and I'm going to ask Dennis to deliver Mr. LaRouche's response to this. Earlier this week, the Justice Department announced that it will investigate the death of a young black man on Staten Island, who was placed in a chokehold by a New York City police officer. The entire incident was videotaped, and the video has been widely circulated by the news media. After both the Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island grand juries determined not to indict the police officers involved in the deaths, civil rights leaders have labeled the U.S. grand jury system broken and have called on the federal government to address this problem. Do you believe our grand jury system is broken, and what are your views on Justice Department reforms?
Well, what Lyndon LaRouche had to say about this in discussions earlier today is that there are grounds for some part of the system to express grave doubts about the authority of the justice system, especially under Obama. He said it's not that they're excluding an indictment in the mentioned case. They're simply stating their opposition to a rush to indict. He said this is a temporary decision, not a final one, and they clearly are skeptical of the validity of the evidence presented to date and want to find out more. He said it's as if they were trying to force the issue to a head. Now, what that issue is, the broader point, Mr. LaRouche said, is that across the country, people are disgusted with the standards of justice being applied. We're getting a fascist type of justice in the system under Obama, and in fact under the last two presidencies of Bush and Obama. He said both of them are stinking specimens, especially Obama. So people have no trust in them, nor in the most prominent Republicans who share the same outlook. He said that the New York decision was an expression of the fact that most Americans do not trust the incumbent institutions of justice. They've had a bellyful of it. The people have had it, and so they're responding their own way. And he said it tells you something that it happened in New York. Other states are not trustworthy. And he concluded that the formality of justice is not the issue, either in this situation or more broadly. The instinct of those involved is more to the point. And that's the lesson to be drawn from this case.
Last week on this broadcast, we discussed the urgency of bringing the fight of the BRICS nations to the doorstep of the United States, of breaking through the incredible media blackout, the propaganda lies that are being told inside the United States about what is actually unfolding in most of the rest of the world, and of causing a real debate to take place in the United States such that America be made to dump Obama and the transatlantic system, and to choose instead to join the majority of humanity in forming a new system for the common progress and the common development of all mankind. Now, on Tuesday of this week, there was a very important event held in Washington, D.C. on exactly this topic, sponsored by Executive Intelligence Review. at which Helga Zepp-LaRouche was the keynote speaker. Helga addressed a standing room only crowd of over 100 people, which included diplomats, policymakers, other institutional figures, and citizens, on the subject of why it is urgent that the United States and Europe join with the BRICS, and how it is that the fate of civilization very much depends on it. Helga opened her presentation as follows. I think it is a fair statement to say that the future destiny of mankind will depend on the question if the United States, and to a secondary degree Europe, will take up the offer made by President Xi Jinping to President Obama at the press conference during the APEC conference, where he invited the United States and other major nations to cooperate with a whole set of policies promoted by China and also the BRICS countries. This set of policies is naturally, on the one side, the new Silk Road. It is the idea of a new credit mechanism around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but also the new Silk Road Development Fund and similar mechanisms and new institutions. Helga then referred to the offer of Xi Jinping for the U.S. to join in the inclusive policy, the win-win system of the BRICS, as the lifeboat for a bankrupt transatlantic world. Mrs. LaRouche went on in the course of her presentation to cover first the bankrupt situation of the transatlantic, which is the basis for the danger of the outbreak of World War III. She then went on to develop the alternative view, a vivid picture for the audience of what the world could look like under a new system, with an overview of the beautiful development projects which are either proposed or some which are already underway on each continent of the globe. And that if we choose this future, rather than the provocation to war that you've just outlined, Dennis, mankind does have a true basis for peace. Helga closed her presentation with an appeal to all present. She said, "I'm absolutely convinced that if we don't come to this kind of joint collaboration on the common aims of mankind and define the present from the future, that we think, where do we want mankind to be 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now? And we want mankind to exist, don't we? Then let's throw overboard all of these stupid axiomatic assumptions which presently conduct policy and which are bringing us to the brink of extinction, because we are close to that if the stuff against Russia and China continues. So I think what is needed, therefore, in the United States is exactly what Prime Minister Modi called for in India, a mass movement for development." So Dennis, I'd like to ask you, one, if you could give us an updated picture on the BRICS developments around the world, and secondly, what more must be done to answer Helga's call for the United States to be brought into this process?
Yeah, sure. This lifeboat to get people safely off the sinking transatlantic, the Titanic of the transatlantic system, this little lifeboat is now bigger than the transatlantic Titanic itself. I mean, more than half of humanity is actually actively part of this new system. And of course, as you were noting in your remarks, this is the alternative to the war danger which the planet otherwise faces. We have to gain some time by removing Newland and a little more time by removing Obama immediately from office. But the actual construction of an entirely new system, a new paradigm, is the only possible lasting basis for peace in a new era, a new mission for mankind. What I'd like to do is to talk about some of the qualitative things, the qualitative changes which have occurred in this new BRICS system over the course of this last week. It's not just a question of how many tens of thousands of kilometers of track have been laid, and there's a lot, or how many gigawatts of electricity is being built, and there's a lot of that too, or anything like that. What's actually involved is that there's an entirely new system which is in place and which is being activated. It's a system which focuses on physical economy, not money. It's a system which is building a peace among equal sovereign nations, a peace of Westphalia, not border conflicts and wars. And it is future-oriented, not stuck with its nose in the present. And they are also thinking about all of humanity, not just about themselves. In other words, people are starting to think differently. And that's the most important development. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. Let's first take the case of the Nicaraguan Interoceanic Canal, which is something that was agreed upon at the BRICS summit with in the period leading into the BRICS summit and out of the BRICS summit in July of this year. It's a project which Nicaragua has undertaken with Chinese corporations, and the groundbreaking is actually going to occur on December 22nd. In other words, we're really just weeks away from this. Now, normally people would say in a situation like this, and you hear this all the time when you talk with people, where is the money going to come from? Where is the money? How are we going to get the money? Who's going to invest? How much does it cost? But that's not what they're talking about right now in Nicaragua. They have a different kind of problem. They're going to be employing 50,000 workers and a lot of machinery to build this canal. So the problem that they're facing is, how are they going to feed these folks? And it's been determined that what they need, they have announced, they need 37.5 tons of rice per day, which, by the way, comes to about a half kilogram of rice per day, which is about 1.5 pounds per capita, which is a reasonable amount for a culture that consumes a lot of rice. Vegetables, they need 25 tons a day. That comes out to about a pound per capita. And then on the meat front, they have to have 12.5 tons a day, which is about a half a pound per capita. They don't specify whether it's beef or chicken or what, but they will, I'm sure. So the point is, what's going on here is not a discussion about where's the money, but where's the beef? In other words, it's a bill of materials. It's a question of looking at your objective of where you want to be. It's a future-oriented approach, and you say, okay, what do we need? What's the bill of materials required to actually get there? And for each of the components of the bill of materials, you then, in turn, look at the bill of materials for that, exactly as Mr. LaRouche has specified in his discussion of physical economy. Now, when you, just a note of caution on this thing, when you do this kind of planning, when you establish where you need to be and what period of time, and plan backwards of what you have to do to get there, sometimes it will turn out, as they say, that you can't get there from here. In other words, there is no way in the world that under existing technologies you can develop a bill of materials that actually will do the job. So what do? Throw in the towel and say, see, I told you, we need to go back to speculation? Of course not. You say, well, then we damn well better have a technological revolution, and we need to figure out a new way to do things such that the parameters of the bill of materials are changed, are altered, which is what human beings typically do. So that's one of the things that's been going on, which is actually quite exciting. There was, incidentally, a meeting of the Latin American political parties called the COPAL in Mexico City, which some of our members attended there, which got a briefing from the Nicaraguan director of the canal project, who incidentally is also the dean of the National Agronomy University there. His name is Telemaco Talavera Siles, and he gave a very upbeat, very exciting briefing on what they're going to do, and said, listen, there's just lies about China out there. Everybody says that China's coming in and taking all the jobs. It's not true. They're doing things they have to do, and Nicaraguans are doing the rest. And he said, as a matter of fact, there's plenty of room for you Mexicans to join in, so come on board on this thing. So everybody was very happy about this whole thing, except for perhaps Wall Street and maybe some of the tens of thousands of chickens that are being sought for useful consumption in Nicaragua. Now, I'll give you a second example of the different thinking. This is physical economic thinking, not money thinking. Take the case of India-China border disputes. This is serious. These countries, two members of the BRICS, have fought wars over this, and not so long ago. And it's not something that you dispel just by saying, oh, let's, all be friends again. It's something that can only be solved in the context of the kind of win-win approach to foreign relations which Xi Jinping was talking about. And there was a meeting on December 1st in Beijing University, which was addressed by, respectively, the Indian and the Chinese heads of recent border negotiations between the two countries. On the Indian side, Shiv Shankar Menon, and on the Chinese side, Dai Bingguo, who is a former state councilor. And they both headed their countries' respective 2012 border talks. And what Menon said I found to be absolutely fascinating. He said, and I quote, "I think we can do it, solve the border disputes, because we have governments in both countries today who have strong mandates and very clear strategic ideas where they want to take their countries." Close quote. Then just before coming on air, I got a report that the health ministers of the BRICS countries had met, and they are developing a joint anti-tuberculosis drug production program, which they plan to make available, free if needed, to their entire populations. And the statement that was made by the Brazilian health minister to explain this was, "We believe in technology and we are taking responsibility for the health of the entire planet's population." Now that's a little bit different than what you get from Wall Street speculators or Obamacare, I dare to say. But that's the way these folks are thinking. And a final example is what happened when President Putin of Russia traveled to Turkey earlier this week. He was there on December 1st, and one thing he did is he simply canceled all of the negotiations and the talk about the South Stream gas pipeline. Why? Because this had gone around the block 1,000 times, and Bulgaria was simply refusing to allow the pipeline to go through their country. And as you can see on the map, which we've prepared for you here, the South Stream pipeline, which was designed to bring gas from Russia to all of Europe, going through southern Europe, its transit after crossing from Russia is to go through Bulgaria. But Bulgaria, under pressure from the European Union, was emphatically refusing. So finally, Putin said, "Fine, to hell with you. We're going to do it a different way. We're going to work out a deal with Turkey." And what you see here on the map is one of the possible routes, not necessarily the one adopted, which would make use of the Blue Stream pipeline coming from Russia, crossing over Turkey, and then going into Greece. And see you later, Bulgaria. Now, the Bulgarians and others in Europe are yelling and screaming about this because they've just realized that if this is in fact what happens, they are going to lose $400 million a year in transit fees that they otherwise would have collected. But they apparently are more interested in following the EU dictates on this thing. So that's one interesting thing that happened there. But more to the point of what I'm getting at with this new way of thinking was the fact that Russia and Turkey signed an agreement for Russia to build nuclear plants in Turkey based on an 100-year deal. And I quote Sergei Kirienko, the CEO of Rosatom, the Russian nuclear agency. He said, "We are giving 60 years of guarantee for the Akuyu nuclear plant, but I'm sure that we'll have a lifespan of 80 to 100 years. We signed an agreement that undertakes mutual commitments for over 100 years. 100 years. So I guess the half-life of economic thinking and projects in the BRICS is 100 years. Compare that to what happens with the derivative speculation in the transatlantic sector. Given the floating exchange rate system, where you have no idea what the exchange rate is going to be in the next nanosecond, you're lucky if the half-life of an investment is 100 seconds, let alone 100 years. I mean, mayflies might prosper under this circumstance, but I looked it up, by the way. I was curious. Their life, it's about 30 minutes. So bankers think like mayflies on a good day. So, I mean, here you have a future-oriented approach. Remember what Helga Zepp-LaRouche was telling us in the quote that Megan just read. Think forward for 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. And that's not an abstract idea. Here you have a very specific economic deal that was just signed for 100 years. So what you're talking about is a future-oriented approach. And this brings us to the point that also was emphasized by Helga, which is that what we have to do, if we are to bring the United States and also Europe on board away from the sinking Titanic and onto this new giant ocean liner, which is the BRIC system, If that is to happen, what we have to build is a mass movement for development, exactly what the Indian Prime Minister said. And that is what the LaRouche movement is doing in this country and internationally. That's what the New York City project, or the Manhattan Project launched by Mr. LaRouche, is all about. And what he said about this week was that the United States has to come back to its intended principle. This is what we are doing with our organizing approach, centered on Manhattan, on New York City, and spreading out from there. Its intended principle is that it is a single entity. It is not a collection of states. He said this union indivisible is governed by a single body of law, not different laws for different states. He said you may have different mechanics in different specific situations, but in principle, they are one. There is one principle of law. And he said that Alexander Hamilton is the keystone to this idea with the development of his credit system, and Franklin, with his famous join or die motto for the Union, is exactly what we are building again in the United States. And I think what is clear is that this is exactly what now applies on a world scale as well. We have a situation where either those parts of the world, that minority of the planet which has not come on board on the BRICS and related process, either joins with the BRICS or dies. And the danger is that that will be by a thermonuclear confrontation. That must be prevented by the short-term measures which Mr. LaRouche outlined, and by the medium and long-term development prospects reaching 100, 1,000, and 10,000 years into our species' future. In other words, that's our identity today.
Now, in the context of everything that's been said tonight, I think it's appropriate to use this occasion to conclude our proceedings here with a short discussion of Mr. LaRouche's unique leadership role in the last several decades, bringing the United States and Russia into a unique partnership and building an alliance of the Eurasian great powers. But to do so by saying a few words in memoriam of a collaborator of Mr. LaRouche's in that effort, a dear friend of Mr. LaRouche's, the late Stanislav Menshikov, who has just passed away 3 weeks ago on November 13th at his home in Amsterdam. And I think that the role that Mr. LaRouche has played as a true friend of Russia within the United States was exemplified by his close personal friendship with Professor Menshikov. Stanislav Mikhailovich Menshikov, who had just turned 87 years old this year, had been a very prominent leading Russian economist for much of the 20th century, with an expertise in the dynamics of the economic system of the United States. His father, Mikhail Menshikov, had served as the Soviet ambassador to the United States during the Eisenhower administration during the late 1950s, at which point Stanislav had his first occasion to visit the United States. As a young man, Stanislav Menshikov lived with his father in London, where apparently one of his earliest memories was as a schoolboy in the early 1930s. And this gives you a good sense of his character, when he was harshly disciplined by his schoolteacher for refusing to sing Rule Britannia in class. In 1966, Stanislav Menshikov published a very influential book titled Millionaires and Managers: The Structure of the Financial Oligarchy in the USA. He later went on to co-author several books with another close friend of his, John Kenneth Galbraith, leading economic advisor to both President Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. And more recently, Professor Menshikov had written a book titled The Anatomy of Russian Capitalism, which was translated into English and published in 2007 by Executive Intelligence Review. This book is available for purchase, and it's a very useful background for people who wish to understand the current conditions within Russia today. Now, Professor Menshikov participated in many conferences and seminars sponsored by the Schiller Institute and by EIR over the years, not only as an individual, but as a delegated representative of a prominent grouping in the Russian Academy of Sciences centered around the late academician Dmitry Lvov. Professor Menshikov counted Lyndon LaRouche as his close personal friend, as well as Mr. LaRouche's wife, Helga. In 2007, the same year this book was published, Professor Menshikov invited both Lyndon and Helga LaRouche to Moscow to participate in a celebration of his 80th birthday, which was held at the Presidium of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he introduced both Lyndon and Helga LaRouche to the attendees as his personal guests. In his speech, Menshikov projected a vision of where the world could be by the year 2027, which would have been the 100th anniversary of his birth, Menshikov's 100th birthday. And this vision was built around Lyndon LaRouche's idea of the Eurasian land bridge, which Menshikov said would be the cornerstone of the new international order. I just want to read a short selection from Menshikov's speech at this birthday celebration. He said, "Lyndon LaRouche, who is present here today, has put forward the conception of building the Eurasian land bridge. The Eurasian land bridge is a program of cooperation with the participation of the USA, Western Europe, Russia with its scientific potential and enormous mineral resources, China, and India. Cooperation for the purpose of building and reorganizing the economic infrastructure over the next 50 years. This will stimulate the progressive growth of the entire world economy. But this plan can only be implemented if there is a cooperation among all of those countries, if their development proceeds in a conflict-free way. Lyndon LaRouche believes that one of the areas of such cooperation needs to be a monetary and financial reform, which he calls a new Bretton Woods. This means to establish a fundamentally new monetary system, which in some of its features will recall the old Bretton Woods, the system established at the end of the Second World War, which was subsequently destroyed. Such a new world monetary and financial system, once more, will have to be based on cooperation among all the countries I mentioned. Thus, 2027 may be a year by which the planet has been turned upside down in terms of its economy. At the peak, on top, will be countries that were formerly considered the Third World, while the traditionally industrialized countries will find that their place in the international division of labor will be determined by certain highly developed, specialized sectors producing goods and services. My last pronouncement will be this, that Russia's path will be a path that upholds these projects for world cooperation. That this, while orienting towards the Eurasian triangle of Russia, China, India, but without forgetting the industrialized countries, Russia should take part in those programs that will lead to conflict-free development that brings about a steady upswing of the world economy. Now, in response to Professor Menshikov's speech, Mr. LaRouche stood up and delivered some remarks at this birthday celebration, in which he said the following. He said, "The time has come to change some of the axiomatic features of currently ongoing world history. Europe is a collection of failed states west of the Russian and Belarusian border. Therefore, the United States must change its behavior by approaching Russia, China, and India in order to create a new order of relations in the world, bringing all the smaller nations in to cooperate with them. I think we can do it. We can change history. What I think is urgent at this time is a program for action. First of all, intellectual action. there must be more discussion, particularly between leading layers of senior people in Russia and in the United States. We have to establish a sense of the reality of this possibility. In that case, we can probably win over the political process under the heat of crisis to recognize that this is the only alternative to what is presently the most dangerous situation in all modern history. So I think that you can see that what both Professor Menshikov and Lyndon LaRouche said at that time, almost 8 years ago, is very prescient of precisely where the world finds itself now, as we're working to bring the United States into the BRICS and to stop the immediate threat of World War III. It was also during this same event that Russian academician who was then the head of the Council for the Study of Productive Forces, Alexander Gronberg, who also passed away recently in 2010, proposed that the Bering Strait tunnel connection, which you have a picture of on your screen, which is the keystone project of this entire World Eurasian Land Bridge, which Menshikov was referring to, proposed that this Bering Strait connection be completed by the year 2027, which would have been Professor Menshikov's 100th birthday, and that the city on the Russian side of the tunnel be named after Stanislav Menshikov, to which Menshikov's wife leaped up and responded, and on the American side, there will be a city named after Lyndon LaRouche. So not only does this project, the Bering Strait Tunnel project, symbolize the necessary strategic friendship between these two great nations, Russia and the United States, but I think it also symbolizes a close personal friendship between two great men, the late Stanislav Menshikov and Lyndon LaRouche. In conclusion, I want to just read an excerpt from birthday greetings that Professor Menshikov sent to Lyndon LaRouche for LaRouche's 90th birthday, which occurred in 2012, which were included in a collection of such greetings that came in from all around the world. And I think this is a very proper conclusion for tonight's broadcast. This is what he had to say. I am happy to be able to congratulate Lyndon LaRouche on his 90th birthday. He is a rare case of human activity, his being so active. Lyndon is an example of a creative mind that never stops emanating original ideas. And quite frankly, I am full of envy that at 90 years he can do all that he is doing. This is, of course, a result of God's goodwill. I cannot put it differently, because usually such brilliant minds are not blessed with the kind of stamina and health that have helped Lyndon to continue his activity at this age. I believe this shows that God not only gives him this possibility, but that God also approves of the way Lyndon has been acting all these years. Otherwise, it would not happen. So my first thought was that I envy Lyndon in a good way. My health is not as good, and he gives me an example that I try to follow. I hope that he will go on in this way for years to come, contributing to human scientific knowledge. LaRouche is the author of theoretical discoveries in the area I work in, which is the world economy. It doesn't mean that we share the same view of everything, and we have been arguing as many times as we have met over the years. But that also does not mean that we are adversaries, for we both know that we are thinking in the same way and in the same direction. I wish Lyndon good health for many years and a happy family life with Helga, his wonderful companion. Professor Stanislav Menshikov, August 28th, 2012. So with that said, I would like to bring a conclusion to our broadcast here tonight. I would like to thank both Dennis Small and Megan Beats for joining me here, And thank you to all of you who tuned in. Please stay tuned to LaRouchePack.com, and good night.